somewhere in a London archive, buried beneath centuries of bureaucratic dust, sits a map so catastrophically wrong that the ink stains on its parchment can be measured not in miles, but in human lives, millions of them, stretching across mountains that never existed, borders that no shepherd ever recognized, and empires that bled themselves dry defending lines drawn by men who had never once set foot on the land they were carving up. If you are new here, smash that like button and subscribe, because we are just getting started on stories that your history textbook never had the courage to tell you. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? Whether it is Lahore, London, Tehran, New York, or somewhere in between, I want to know, and tell me in the comments what you want me to cover next. Should it be the forgotten empire that once ruled 3 continents before vanishing in a single generation? Or the ancient trade war that reshaped every religion on earth? You decide. Now let us go back to the very beginning, long before any empire raised its banners over the sun-scorched plateaus of the ancient Near East. Long before any king carved his name into stone, or any general marshaled armies across the horizon, there were the people the historians would later call the Proto-Elamites, a civilization so ancient and so sophisticated that they had developed a writing system nearly 5,000 years before the first misguided cartographer ever lifted his pen. These were not wandering nomads scratching survival from bare rock. They were urban architects, merchants, and accountants who built cities along the rivers and mountain valleys of what we now call southwestern Iran and southeastern Iraq, establishing trade networks that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the highlands of Anatolia. And they left behind clay tablets covered in symbols that scholars are still struggling to decode today, as though history itself decided to bury its deepest secrets in a language that refuses to be read. The story of Elam does not begin with a single king or a single battle. It begins with a river, the Iran River, cutting through the Zagros mountains like a silver blade through ancient rock, fed the lowland plains around the city of Susa. And it was here, around 320 BCE, that the Elamite civilization first coalesced into something that the ancient world would spend the next 2,000 years either trading with, fighting against, or desperately trying to absorb. The Elamites were not a people who announced themselves to history with a grand flourish. They materialized slowly through commerce and craft, through the patient accumulation of surplus grain and traded copper, through the building of temples whose ziggurats rose against the sky like challenges to the gods themselves. By the time the Mesopotamian city-states to the west had grown powerful enough to take notice, the Elamites had already constructed a political system so sophisticated that it baffled their neighbors. A federated monarchy in which multiple kings ruled simultaneously across different regions, answering to an overlord they called the Sakalma, a title that translates roughly as Grand Regent. And the Sukalma answered to no one except the cosmic order he was sworn to maintain. It was a system that worked for centuries, which in the ancient world was nothing short of miraculous. And the secret of its endurance was not military power, but an intricate web of royal marriages, diplomatic gifts, and carefully managed trade routes that connected Elam to every major civilization of the ancient Near East. A fact that historians sometimes overlook in their rush to celebrate the more spectacular empires that came after. The single greatest achievement of the Elamite civilization was not a military victory, though they had many of those, including the astonishing raid on Babylon around 1155 BCE, in which the Elamite king Shudraknahant carried off the famous stele of Hammurabi. The law code that the Babylonians considered the foundation of civilized order, and brought it back to Susa as a trophy, essentially kidnapping the written law of an entire civilization. No, the greatest achievement of Elam was cultural and artistic, because the Elamite craftsmen produced bronze work, glazed brickwork, and sculptural compositions that would influence Persian art for more than a millennium after the Elamite state itself had ceased to exist. The palace at Susa, even in its earliest form, was decorated with a visual sophistication that the Greek observers who encountered it much later would describe in terms of barely contained astonishment. And the Elamite language, which belonged to a language family all its own, completely unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European tongues, survived long enough to appear on the trilingual inscriptions of the Persian Empire, carved alongside Old Persian and Akkadian, as though the Persians themselves recognized that Elamite was a language too important to be simply discarded. The Elamites understood something that their conquerors would repeatedly fail to grasp: that cultural persistence is a form of military victory, and a people who keep their language, their art, and their religion are never truly defeated, no matter how many times their walls are knocked down. Yet the Elamite civilization, for all its endurance, carried within it the seeds of a fragmentation that no amount of diplomatic sophistication could ultimately prevent. The federated structure that had been its greatest strength became its greatest vulnerability when the Assyrian Empire, under King Ashurbanipal, one of the most methodically brutal rulers the ancient world ever produced, launched a series of campaigns between 664 and 639 BCE that did not simply defeat Elam, but systematically dismembered it. Ashurbanipal did not merely conquer cities. He personally supervised the humiliation of Elamite royal corpses, the destruction of ancestral tombs, and the scattering of the bones of Elamite kings to the four winds. An act of deliberate cultural annihilation designed to sever the Elamites from their own past in a way that mere military defeat never could. But even Ashurbanipal, for all his ferocity, could not erase what the Elamites had built into the very DNA of the region. And when a new people rose from the mountains of western Iran a century after Elam's collapse, they would inherit the Elamite legacy in everything from administrative practice to artistic tradition to the very shape of the royal court. A legacy so deeply embedded that you could argue, without too much exaggeration, that Elam never truly fell, but simply transformed itself, phoenix-like, into the Persian Empire that was about to change everything. With the collapse of the Elamite federated structure under Assyrian pressure, and with the Assyrian Empire itself beginning to show the first deep cracks that would eventually bring it crashing down within a generation, the political landscape of the ancient Near East entered a state of extraordinary flux, a brief, chaotic intermission between civilizations, during which no single power dominated, and every ambitious king with an army and a dream began to imagine what might be possible in a world without a hegemon. It was precisely into this vacuum that a relatively obscure Iranian people, herding their horses across the windswept plateau of what is now Fars province in southwestern Iran, began the most improbable ascent in the history of the ancient world. The name Cyrus the Great appears in history with the force of a thunderclap, not because he announced himself with great fanfare, but because the speed and totality of his conquests left the ancient world genuinely struggling to explain what had just happened. In 550 BCE, Cyrus II of Persia, ruler of the small kingdom of Anshan in southern Iran, and a vassal of the Median Empire, turned on his overlord Astyages the Mede, and in a campaign that lasted less than a season, dismantled an empire that had dominated the Iranian plateau for nearly a century. The Median army, according to accounts preserved in the Babylonian chronicles, simply switched sides. They handed Astyages over to Cyrus in chains and went home, which tells you everything you need to know about the difference between a ruler who commands loyalty and a ruler who merely commands obedience. Cyrus understood the difference viscerally, and it made him one of the most effective conquerors and administrators in recorded history, a man who built an empire stretching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the borders of India, and yet is remembered in the Hebrew Bible as a liberator, in Zoroastrian tradition as a righteous king, and in Greek historiography as a model of ideal governance. A unanimity of praise across enemy traditions that is, to put it plainly, almost without precedent in the ancient world. The peak of the Achaemenid achievement was not the empire of Cyrus himself, extraordinary as it was, but rather the administrative and cultural synthesis achieved under Darius I, who came to power in 522 BCE after a violent succession crisis, and proceeded to transform a loosely connected series of conquered territories into the most sophisticated administrative state the world had yet seen. Darius divided his empire into 20 provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who was held accountable through a system of royal inspectors, known as the eyes and ears of the king, a phrase that carries a chilling resonance even now. 25 centuries later, he built the Royal Road, a paved highway stretching 270 kilometers from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland, along which royal couriers could travel the entire distance in just 7 days using a relay system of horse stations. A communications infrastructure so effective that it would not be surpassed in speed or reliability until the telegraph in the 19th century CE. He commissioned the construction of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital whose ruins in modern Iran remain one of the most astonishing architectural sites on the planet, a city built not for practical governance, but for the theatrical demonstration of imperial power. Its enormous stone staircases, carved with processional reliefs, showing tribute bearers from every corner of the known world, bringing their offerings to the great king, each figure rendered with such individual specificity. This one wears Armenian dress, that one carries Ethiopian ivory, the next leads a Bactrian camel, that you can reconstruct the ethnic geography of the Achaemenid Empire simply by walking up a staircase. The empire at its height under Darius covered approximately 5.5 million square kilometers and contained an estimated 44% of the entire world's population at the time, a proportion of humanity under a single political authority that has never been equaled before or since. And yet, Darius administered it with a light enough hand that most of the peoples under his rule maintained their own languages, their own laws, and their own religious practices. A model of imperial pluralism so ahead of its time that modern political scientists still cite it. But the same Darius, whose administrative genius built this extraordinary structure, also made the decision that would eventually trigger its unraveling. He extended his ambitions westward toward the Greek city-states of the Aegean, and in 490 BCE, he sent an army across the sea to punish Athens for supporting a revolt in his Ionian Greek provinces. That army met the Athenians and their Plataean allies at a coastal plain called Marathon, and suffered a defeat so unexpected, so total, and so psychologically shattering that it planted a seed of Greek confidence that would grow over the following century and a half into the force that ultimately destroyed everything Darius had built. Darius died in 486 BCE. Before he could launch the second invasion he was already planning, and the task fell to his son Xerxes I, who crossed the Hellespont in 480 BCE with an army that ancient sources described as so large it drank rivers dry, a claim that modern historians scale back considerably. But the army was certainly among the largest ever assembled in the ancient world up to that point, perhaps 250,000 soldiers strong, and it came within a hair's breadth of succeeding. Xerxes burned Athens, which stood empty of its citizens, who had evacuated by sea. and for a brief, terrible moment, the Persian flag flew over the sacred ground of the Acropolis. But the Athenian navy, commanded by the brilliant tactician Themistocles, destroyed the Persian fleet at Salamis, and the land army was defeated at Plataea the following year, and Xerxes returned to Persia with an empire intact, but a prestige badly dented. And the damage was not merely strategic, but psychological. The idea that Persia was invincible had been cracked, and once cracked, such ideas never fully sealed themselves again. Then, from the northwest, across the waters of the Aegean, and through the mountain passes of Thrace, a new force materialized that the Persian court, drowning in luxury and succession intrigue, had catastrophically underestimated Alexander III of Macedon, whom history would call the Great, with a unanimity that itself tells a story, crossed into Asia in 334 BCE at the head of an army of perhaps 43,000 men, a force that was, by any objective measure, absurdly smaller than what the Persian Empire could theoretically put into the field. And yet, Alexander defeated 3 Persian armies in 3 pitched battles, including the decisive engagement at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where the Persian king Darius III fielded perhaps 200,000 men, and still lost, in part because of Alexander's tactical genius, and in part because the Achaemenid administrative system had created so many satellite peoples with so few reasons for genuine loyalty that, when the empire began to crack, the cracks ran all the way through. Darius III fled the Battle of Gaugamela, was murdered by his own courtiers shortly afterward, and Alexander, stepping over the body of the last Achaemenid king, declared himself the heir to the Persian Empire. And then, in a gesture of calculated symbolism that still reverberates, had Persepolis, the sacred heart of Persian imperial identity, burned to the ground with the fall of the Achaemenid Empire and the spectacular but brief interlude of Alexander's Macedonian supremacy, which lasted barely a decade before Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, almost certainly of fever complicated by chronic alcoholism and the accumulated wounds of a decade of constant warfare. The stage was cleared for one of the most fascinating and underappreciated empires in all of ancient history, a dynasty that would hold the Iranian plateau and much of the surrounding world for nearly 5 centuries, and that would eventually produce the cultural and political template from which the Sassanid Empire and later the Islamic caliphates would draw their most enduring institutional forms. When Alexander's generals began carving up his empire in the chaos that followed his death, it was Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's most capable officers, a man of Macedonian origin and breathtaking ambition, who claimed the eastern portions of the conquered territories, founding the Seleucid Empire in 312 BCE, and establishing a dynasty that would rule in diminishing form For the next 2.5 centuries, Seleucus was a remarkable figure in his own right. He fought his way back from near total obscurity, having been left out of the initial division of Alexander's empire to eventually control a territory stretching from Anatolia to the borders of India. And he did it through a combination of military brilliance, political flexibility, and a genuine willingness to adapt himself to the cultures he ruled. That was rare among Macedonian generals, who tended to see everything non-Greek as inherently inferior. Seleucus founded dozens of cities, many of them named after himself or his family: Antioch, Seleucia, Apamea. And these cities became centers of Greek cultural influence in the East, but they never fully displaced the deeper currents of Iranian and Babylonian civilization that ran beneath the Hellenistic surface like underground rivers, waiting for the moment when the Greek overlay would be thin enough for them to break through again. The cultural achievement of the Seleucid period that deserves recognition is the extraordinary synthesis it produced, almost accidentally, between Greek philosophical tradition and the ancient religious and intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia and Iran. A synthesis that gave rise to astronomical observation techniques, mathematical innovations, and theological speculations that would eventually flow westward back into the Mediterranean world and shape the development of early Christianity, Neoplatonic philosophy, and ultimately the scientific tradition of medieval Islamic civilization. The city of Seleucia on the Tigris, built near the ruins of the old Babylonian capital, became a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, a mixing bowl of cultures and languages in which Greek-speaking philosophers argued with Babylonian astronomers and Zoroastrian priests, while Jewish merchants kept careful records in Aramaic, and Iranian nobles hunted in the vast game parks called paradisos, a Persian word that Greek speakers borrowed to describe their garden estates, and which would eventually, through a long chain of linguistic transmissions, give English the word paradise. The Seleucid period was messy, often violent, and ultimately unstable, but it created a cultural complexity that was genuinely new in the world, and that left marks which no subsequent conquest fully erased. Yet the Seleucid Empire suffered from a structural weakness that Darius I would have recognized immediately. It was too large, too ethnically diverse, and too dependent on the personality of individual kings to maintain cohesion across generations. When the Seleucid king Antiochus III suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of Rome at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, the western portions of the empire began to slip away, and the eastern territories, including the Iranian heartland, became increasingly restive under rulers who were spending more and more of their energy on the Western Mediterranean crisis, and less on the administration of their Asian domains. It was into this administrative vacuum that the Parni, a nomadic Iranian people from the steppes east of the Caspian Sea, descended under their chieftain Arsaces, around 247 BCE, seizing the province of Parthia and beginning the slow, patient process of building what would become one of the most durable empires in ancient history. It was at this moment that the Arsacid dynasty, the Parthians, as the Romans called them, began their extraordinary 5-century reign over the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, a reign that history has consistently undervalued. Because the Parthians left fewer written records and fewer spectacular monuments than either the Achaemenids before them or the Sassanids after them, but whose achievement in holding together a vast, diverse empire against pressure from both Rome in the west and nomadic peoples in the east deserves far more credit than it typically receives. The Parthian achievement reached its height under Mithridates II, who ruled from 124 to 91 BCE, and who expanded Parthian territory to its greatest extent, stretching from the Euphrates in the west to eastern Iran, while simultaneously establishing the sophisticated Silk Road trade network that would channel goods and ideas between China and Rome for the next 5 centuries. Mithridates II called himself King of Kings, a title borrowed directly from the Achaemenid tradition, and the adoption of that title was not mere vanity. It was a deliberate assertion of Iranian imperial continuity, a claim that the Parthian Empire was not a new creation, but the restoration of an ancient tradition that had merely been temporarily interrupted by the Macedonian intrusion. The cultural achievement of this era was the Parthian synthesis of Iranian royal tradition with Hellenistic artistic conventions and Mesopotamian administrative practice, a synthesis visible in the extraordinary sculptures from Palmyra and Hatra in the Parthian era artwork that combines Greek composition with Iranian symbolic vocabulary, and in the survival of the Zoroastrian religious tradition as a living force even under rulers who were happy to also patronize Greek temples and Babylonian cults, understanding instinctively that religious tolerance was not a luxury, but an administrative necessity. However, the Parthian Empire's very flexibility, its tolerance of regional autonomy, its acceptance of multiple cultural traditions, its preference for indirect control over direct administration, ultimately made it vulnerable to a new force that arose from within its own territories. The Parthians governed their empire as a loose confederation of semi-independent kingdoms and noble houses, bound to the Arsacid dynasty by loyalty and mutual interest, rather than by the kind of centralized bureaucratic control that Darius had built. And this meant that when an ambitious regional lord decided that his moment had come, the machinery to stop him was simply not there. That regional lord was Ardashir I, ruler of the small kingdom of Persis in southwestern Iran, the original heartland of the Achaemenid kings. And in a series of battles between 224 and 226 CE, he defeated and killed the last Parthian king. Artabanus IV, and proclaimed himself the founder of a new dynasty that would restore the full glory of Persian imperial power. The name of that dynasty was Sassanid, and the story it told about itself was deliberately, consciously, and unmistakably a story about the return of something ancient, something that had been interrupted but never truly broken. Then, from the east and west, simultaneously, the pressures that would define the next 4 centuries began to build. The Roman Empire, consolidating its hold on the western margins of the ancient Near East, the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppe, probing the northeastern frontiers with increasing frequency and force, and the internal contradictions of a highly centralized religious political system beginning to generate the kind of heat that, left unmanaged, eventually produces an explosion. But before any of that happened, the Sassanid Empire would produce some of the most extraordinary cultural and intellectual achievements in the ancient world. And it would do so in a context of nearly constant warfare that makes the creativity even more remarkable in retrospect. Ardashir I founded his dynasty on a claim so audacious that even his own contemporaries must have found it breathtaking. He declared that the Sassanid kings were the direct heirs of the Achaemenid tradition, that the 5 centuries of Parthian rule had been an interruption rather than a legitimate succession, and that with his accession, the true Persian Empire had been restored in its rightful form. The ideological weight of this claim was staggering, and Ardashir backed it up with institutional substance. He established Zoroastrianism as the official state religion for the first time in Iranian history, creating a hierarchical priestly class called the Magi, who would play a role in Sassanid governance somewhat analogous to the role of the Catholic Church in medieval European politics, providing ideological legitimacy to the monarchy, while simultaneously accumulating independent power that would sometimes compete with royal authority. He rebuilt the central administration on Achaemenid lines, established a professional standing army rather than the Parthian reliance on noble cavalry levies, and founded a new capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River that would remain the heart of Sassanid power for the next 4 centuries. A city that, at its height, was larger than Rome and contained architectural wonders, including the great vault of the palace, known as the Tak Kasra, the largest single-span brick arch ever constructed in the ancient world, a structure so enormous that when the Arab armies finally captured Ctesiphon in 637 CE, they reportedly stood before the arch in stunned silence for several minutes before any of them could speak. The greatest cultural achievement of the Sassanid era, and the competition for that title is fierce, given that this period produced advances in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and literature that would be transmitted to the medieval Islamic world, and from there to medieval Europe, and eventually to the scientific revolution, was arguably the Academy of Gondishapur, founded under Shapur I in the 3rd century CE, and expanded by successive Sassanid kings into the most important center of learning in the ancient world by the 5th and 6th centuries. Gondishapur, located in the southwestern Iranian province of Khuzestan, was not merely a school. It was a fully functioning research hospital, a translation institute, and a philosophical academy that brought together scholars from the Greek, Syriac, Indian, and Persian intellectual traditions under a single institutional roof, and encouraged them to argue, collaborate, translate, and synthesize. When the Emperor Justinian closed the Platonic Academy in Athens in 529 CE, many of the displaced Greek philosophers found refuge at Gondishapur, where the Sassanid king Khosrow I, one of the greatest patrons of learning in the pre-Islamic world, gave them not just sanctuary, but funding and royal encouragement to continue their work. The medical knowledge systematized at Gondishapur, drawing on Greek, Indian, and Persian sources, would flow directly into the great medical tradition of the Islamic Golden Age, and through that tradition into the European universities of the medieval period, which means that a direct intellectual line connects Gondishapur to the development of modern medicine. The chess set arrived from India at the Sassanid court during this era, was analyzed, refined, and transmitted westward, eventually becoming the most widely played board game in human history. A small but perfectly illustrative example of how Gondishapur functioned as a cultural switching station for the entire Eurasian world. Yet for all its cultural brilliance, the Sassanid Empire was simultaneously engaged in a military competition with the Roman and Byzantine empires that was bleeding both civilizations white with a slowness and thoroughness that neither side fully recognized until it was too late. The conflict between the Sassanids and Rome had begun almost with the founding of the dynasty. In 260 CE, the Sassanid king Shapur I achieved what no enemy of Rome had ever achieved before, or would achieve again for many years. He captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive in battle at the engagement near Edessa, and brought him back to Persia as a living trophy. Shapur commemorated this extraordinary humiliation with a series of rock reliefs carved into cliff faces across western Iran that survive to this day, showing the Roman emperor kneeling before the Persian king. An image so powerful and so deliberately constructed for maximum propaganda effect that it continued to infuriate Roman and Byzantine historians for centuries after Valerian's death. But Shapur's triumph was a symptom of a structural problem rather than a solution to it. The Romans adapted, reformed their military, and the cycle of devastating war resumed, punctuated by exhausting truces, neither side capable of delivering a knockout blow, both sides burning through resources that they desperately needed for internal investment and frontier defense against the nomadic peoples pressing on their respective borders from other directions. The final catastrophic phase of this centuries-long competition came under the Sassanid King Khosrow II, who launched the most successful Persian offensive against the Byzantine Empire in history, capturing Jerusalem in 614 CE, seizing the true cross as a trophy, and occupying Egypt by 619 CE, at which point the Sassanid Empire controlled almost exactly the same territories as the old Achaemenid domain at its peak, and it must have seemed to Khosrow that the dream of restoration was finally complete. But the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius responded with a counteroffensive so brilliant that it constitutes one of the great military comebacks in history, penetrating deep into the Sassanid heartland, and by 628 CE Khosrow II had been overthrown and murdered by his own son. The Sassanid state had lost both its greatest king and its greatest conquests, and the treasury that Khosrow had spent decades filling was empty. In the decade that followed, 10 different kings sat on the Sassanid throne in rapid succession, a dynastic chaos that destroyed institutional coherence, alienated the noble houses and the religious establishment, and left the empire's borders defended by exhausted armies that had not been properly supplied or paid in years. Then, from the southwest, from a direction that the Sassanid strategic planners had always regarded as something of a backwater, a new force emerged that nobody in Ctesiphon had seen coming with anything like the speed or the scale that it actually arrived. This instability continued until the Arab-Muslim armies under the commanders of the first caliphs delivered the final blow at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 CE and the Battle of Nahevand in 642 CE. And by 651 CE, the last Sassanid king, Yazdijerd III, had been murdered by a miller near the city of Merv in what is now Turkmenistan, chased to the end of his realm and beyond by Arab pursuers who had, within a single decade, accomplished what Rome had failed to accomplish in 4 centuries of trying: the complete destruction of the Persian imperial state. But the Sassanid legacy, like the Elamite legacy before it, proved far more durable than the state that had carried it. The Islamic Caliphate that absorbed the former Sassanid territories would itself be transformed by what it absorbed. The administrative traditions, the literary conventions, the philosophical methods, the architectural forms, even the court ceremonial of the Sassanid kings would reappear, only slightly modified, in the Abbasid Caliphate that moved its capital to Baghdad in 762 CE, barely 100 miles from the ruins of Ctesiphon, as though the gravitational pull of the old Sassanid heartland was simply too strong to resist. With the fall of the Sassanid Empire and the extraordinary rapid expansion of the Arab Caliphate across the former Persian world, the stage was set for a new chapter in the history of the Iranian plateau, one in which the Persian language and Persian cultural identity would survive not despite Islamic conquest, but in many ways because of it, finding in the new religion and the new empire a vehicle for cultural expression that would produce some of the greatest literature, philosophy, and architecture in the history of human civilization. The story of how a conquered people turned their conquest into a cultural triumph is one of the most remarkable in all of human history, and it begins in earnest with the Abbasid Revolution of 750 CE, when a coalition of forces that included a very large proportion of Iranian Muslims overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate, which had kept political power firmly in Arab hands, and replaced it with a dynasty that drew its strength from the full multi-ethnic population of the Islamic world. The first Abbasid Caliph, Abu al-Abbas, took power with an army whose backbone was the Khorasani troops from northeastern Iran. Iranians who had converted to Islam, but who had never accepted the notion that Arab ethnicity conferred superior status in God's eyes or in the caliph's court. And the cultural consequences of this shift in political power were immediate and profound. Persian became, alongside Arabic, one of the two languages of the Islamic intellectual world. Iranian administrators, scholars, poets, and philosophers flooded into the court at Baghdad and shaped the institutions of the new caliphate in ways that bore the unmistakable marks of the Sassanid administrative tradition. The bureaucratic culture of the Abbasid Caliphate was, in a very real sense, the Sassanid state system operating under a new theological banner, and the Iranians who staffed it understood this perfectly well. The cultural peak of this era was the Persian literary Renaissance, a movement that began in the 9th century CE and reached its absolute apex in the 10th and 11th centuries, producing a body of poetry, prose, philosophy, and scientific writing in the Persian language, now written in the Arabic script, but unmistakably Persian in its sensibility and its emotional register. That stands as one of the supreme achievements of world literature. The poet Ferdowsi, born around 935 CE in the Khorasan region of northeastern Iran, spent approximately 30 years composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic poem of 60,000 couplets that retells the entire mythological and historical tradition of Iranian civilization, from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest, drawing on Sassanid-era sources and oral traditions to construct a monument of Persian cultural memory so powerful and so complete that it effectively saved the Persian language from being absorbed by Arabic, the way Latin absorbed the Gaulish and Iberian languages in the Western Roman Empire. The Shahnameh is not simply a literary achievement. It is an act of civilizational self-preservation, performed at the exact moment when Persian cultural identity was at its most vulnerable. And the fact that Persian is still spoken today by more than 100 million people owes more to Ferdowsi's 30 years of solitary composition than to any military victory or political decision made by any king. Firdosi was reportedly paid for his masterwork with silver coins rather than the gold he had been promised. And according to legend, he was so disgusted by this slight that he gave the silver away to the bathhouse attendant and the beer seller on his way out of the palace, an act of contemptuous generosity that has made him a hero to writers and artists ever since. But the Abbasid Caliphate was not merely a vehicle for Persian cultural expression. It was also the context in which the Islamic golden age of science and philosophy flourished. And here the intellectual heritage of Gandhishapur played its crucial role. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun established the House of Wisdom in Baghdad as a direct institutional heir of the Gandhishapur tradition, funding the translation into Arabic of every Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac scientific and philosophical text that could be found, and then sponsoring the original research that extended, refined, and in many cases revolutionized the translated knowledge. The mathematician Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, working at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century, developed the mathematical techniques that gave the world the word algebra, from the Arabic title of his treatise, and algorithm, a Latinization of his own name, essentially inventing the conceptual foundations of modern computational mathematics in a Baghdad library that had been stocked with Greek, Indian, and Persian texts. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, born in 980 CE in the region of Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, synthesized the entire medical knowledge of the ancient world in his Canon of Medicine, a text that remained the standard medical reference in both the Islamic world and European universities until the 17th century, making him arguably the most influential physician in the history of medicine. Al-Biruni, a contemporary of Ibn Sina, calculated the circumference of the earth to an accuracy within 1% using trigonometric methods he developed himself, described the rotation of the earth on its axis, and produced an encyclopedic account of Indian science and philosophy that remains a primary historical source today. And all of this in a period when contemporary European scholarship was struggling to preserve even basic classical literacy. The Abbasid Caliphate at its height was the most intellectually sophisticated civilization on the planet, and the Iranian contribution to that sophistication was so central that it is difficult to imagine the Golden Age without it. However, the very sophistication and size of the Abbasid state created the conditions for its fragmentation. As provincial governors accumulated autonomy and powerful vizier families transformed the caliphs from active rulers into ceremonial figureheads. By the 10th century, the Abbasid caliphs had been reduced to puppets in the hands of the Buyid dynasty, a Iranian family from the Caspian region that controlled the court and the military while allowing the caliph to retain religious legitimacy as a kind of symbolic glue holding the Islamic world together. Then the Seljuk Turks arrived from Central Asia, sweeping through Khorasan and Persia in the 1030s and 1040s under their leader Tughril, who captured Baghdad in 1055 CE and established himself as Sultan, a Turkish word meaning power or authority, with the Abbasid Caliph retained as a purely spiritual figurehead, an arrangement that would define the political structure of the Islamic Middle East for the next 2 centuries, with Turkic military power providing the force, while Persian administrative and cultural tradition provided the substance. A partnership so productive that it generated some of the most beautiful mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais ever built, including the Great Friday Mosque of Isfahan, whose successive building campaigns trace 6 centuries of Islamic architectural development in a single extraordinary structure. Yet the Seljuk achievement, like all the great achievements of this region, carried the seeds of its own end. The dynasty fragmented into competing regional branches, each sultan challenged by brothers and nephews with their own armies, each frontier pushed by forces that the central administration lacked the coherence to resist. Then, from the northeast, across the endless grass oceans of Central Asia, a catastrophe arrived that was not merely a military defeat, but something closer to an extinction event. The name of Genghis Khan arrives in Iranian history like a crack of cosmic thunder, a sound so sudden and so total that everything before and after it occupies different acoustic registers, as if the world itself were divided into the time before the Mongols and the time after them, with the silence between those 2 worlds full of the specific, irreplaceable things that were destroyed and can never be recovered. Temujin, who took the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, in 1206 CE, after unifying the Mongolian steppe tribes through a combination of brilliant military strategy, ruthless elimination of rivals, and a genuinely innovative system of meritocratic military organization, turned his attention toward the Islamic world in 1219 CE, after the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire made what must rank as one of the worst diplomatic miscalculations in history. He executed Genghis Khan's trade ambassadors and had their heads sent back as a message. The message Genghis Khan sent in return was written not in ink, but in fire, and it was delivered to every major city in the Iranian world within the space of a decade. Samarkand fell. Bukhara fell. Merv, once one of the largest cities on earth, with perhaps 1 million inhabitants, was destroyed so completely that it never recovered its former status. Contemporary accounts, probably exaggerated but grounded in real catastrophe, describe the Mongols killing the entire population and then counting the skulls to verify the body count, a bureaucratic thoroughness applied to mass murder that carries a particular horror. Nishapur, birthplace of the poet Omar Khayyam, was reduced to rubble. The irrigation systems of Khorasan and Transoxiana, which had sustained dense agricultural populations for millennia, were destroyed so systematically that some regions did not fully recover for centuries, their populations crashing from hundreds of thousands to scattered tens of thousands, subsisting on dry farming, where complex hydraulic agriculture had once flourished. The death toll from the Mongol invasions of the Iranian world is estimated by modern historians at somewhere between 5 and 15 million people, representing perhaps half or more of the total population of the affected regions. A demographic catastrophe comparable, in proportional terms, to the worst episodes of the 20th century. The greatest achievement of the post-Mongol recovery was the Ilkhanate period's extraordinary artistic flowering, a cultural renaissance that emerged, paradoxically, from the very depths of the catastrophe, as the Mongol rulers, who had destroyed so much, gradually converted to Islam, patronized Persian literature and art with the enthusiasm of conquerors trying to legitimize themselves through cultural absorption, and inadvertently created the conditions for the development of illustrated manuscript tradition that represents one of the highest achievements of Islamic visual art. The Mongol Ilkhan Ghazan, who converted to Islam in 1295 CE and took a Persian name alongside his Mongolian one, commissioned magnificent buildings, reformed the tax system to relieve the peasantry who had been crushed by his predecessors' extractive demands, and presided over a court in which Persian poets, historians, and scholars found enthusiastic patronage from rulers who had so recently been their destroyers' heirs. The historian Rashid al-Din, serving as chief minister under Ghazan, wrote the Jami al-Tawarik, compendium of chronicles, the first genuine world history in the Islamic tradition, drawing on Chinese, Mongol, European, Indian, and Persian sources to produce a panoramic account of human civilization that had no precedent in any tradition. A work whose existence is itself a testament to how the Mongol Empire, by connecting Eurasia more thoroughly than it had ever been connected before, inadvertently made comparative history possible for the first time. But the Ilkhanate itself dissolved into factional violence after Ghazan's death, fragmenting into competing principalities that were prey to the next great wave of steppe conquest, this time under Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, who launched his campaigns from Samarkand in the 1370s and visited on the Iranian world a second devastation that, in some ways, surpassed even the Mongol catastrophe in its deliberate theatrical cruelty. Timur built towers of skulls outside the cities he sacked, left pyramids of severed heads as monuments to his passage through the land, and yet commissioned some of the most exquisite architecture ever built in the Islamic world, so that his capital Samarkand and his burial city Shahrazabs are today UNESCO World Heritage Sites of breathtaking beauty. a juxtaposition so extreme that it defies easy moral categorization. Isfahan, the city that would become the defining architectural achievement of the next Iranian dynasty, was sacked by Timur in 1387 CE after its population attempted a revolt. And according to the court historian who accompanied Timur's campaign, 70,000 skulls were used to build the commemorative towers outside the city gates. The survivors who looked at those towers as they returned to rebuild their lives in the ash and rubble of their city carried something forward with them that no Mongol army and no Timurid decree could touch. The literary tradition of Hafez, who had died in Shiraz just 2 years earlier, whose ghazals circulated in manuscript copies throughout the devastated Iranian world and gave people a language for grief, for love, for the persistence of beauty in conditions of absolute loss. That made the cultural tradition feel worth defending, even when the political structures that had sustained it were gone. Then, from the northwest, emerging from the complex political and religious ferment of Azerbaijan and northwestern Iran, a new force materialized that would once again unify the Iranian plateau under a single dynasty and transform the religious identity of the Iranian world in ways that continue to shape geopolitics to this very day. Shah Ismail, I was 16 years old when he rode into Tabriz in 1501 CE and declared himself the Shah of Iran, the first ruler to bear that title in the full sense in many centuries. And the audacity of that claim was matched only by the speed with which he made it reality. Ismail came from a Sufi order called the Safavids, based in the city of Ardabil in northwestern Iran, whose followers had been building a military religious movement for generations, combining Sufi spiritual devotion with Shia Muslim theology and the fighting spirit of the Turkic nomads of the Azerbaijani steps into a force that was, in the early 16th century, militarily irresistible in the Iranian world and religiously transformative in a way that no military force alone could have been. Within a decade of taking Tabriz, Ismail had conquered virtually all of modern Iran, plus Iraq and parts of Central Asia, defeating established Turkic dynasties and rival warlords with a rapidity that seemed to his followers to confirm the supernatural power of their leader. They believed Ismail was literally divine, or at least the manifestation of the hidden Imam, the messianic figure of Shia theology, who had been in occultation since the 9th century, and they went into battle wearing red turbans and carrying the conviction of men who believe they cannot be killed. The Ottoman Sultan Selim I, who watched Ismail's rise with alarm, and who saw in Safavid Shia Islam both a theological challenge and a political threat. Because Shia Iranians living in Ottoman territory might feel greater loyalty to the Safavid Shah than to the Sunni Ottoman Sultan, launched a preemptive military campaign that culminated in the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 CE, where the Ottoman artillery devastated the Safavid cavalry and forced Ismail to retreat. Ismail never fully recovered from Chalderan psychologically. He retreated into his palace, drank heavily, and emerged only occasionally for military campaigns that he no longer approached with his earlier messianic confidence. And the defeat established the fundamental geopolitical fact that would define the Middle East for the next 5 centuries: a Sunni Ottoman Empire in the west, a Shia Safavid successor, Iran in the east, with the line between them running approximately where the modern Turkey-Iran border runs today. The peak of Safavid achievement came under Shah Abbasai, who ruled from 1587 to 1629 CE, and who deserves to be ranked among the most capable monarchs in the history of the world. Not because he was a particularly admirable human being, since he had several of his own sons blinded or killed to prevent succession challenges, and he combined administrative genius with episodes of spectacular cruelty, but because the transformation he wrought on the Iranian state and the Iranian cityscape was so comprehensive and so lasting that its effects are still visible, literally, in the urban fabric of Isfahan, the capital he rebuilt from the ground up as a declaration of Safavid civilizational ambition. Shah Abbas moved the capital from Kazvin to Isfahan in 1598 CE, and over the following 3 decades turned it into the most beautiful planned city in the Islamic world, building the Naqshi Jahan Square, today still one of the largest public squares on earth, measuring 560 meters by 160 meters, around which he arranged the Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque, the Shah Mosque, the Ali Kapu Palace, and the Grand Bazaar in a composition so geometrically sophisticated and architecturally magnificent that European travelers who saw it described it as superior to anything they knew in their own civilization. Isfahan is half the world, went the Persian proverb that dates from this era, Nesfi Jahan. And while the arithmetic is obviously wrong, the sentiment captures something real about the ambition and the achievement. Shah Abbas also reformed the military along European lines, using contacts with both the Portuguese and the English to import cannons and firearms technology, built a road network that rivaled the old Achaemenid royal road in its administrative efficiency, and managed the Safavid silk trade so skillfully that Iranian silk exports transformed the economies of Venice and the Netherlands, making Isfahan a node in the global commercial network that was just beginning to take shape in the early modern period. Yet the Safavid Empire, for all its brilliance, carried a fatal fragility in its bones: the forced conversion of the Iranian population to Twelver Shia Islam, a process that Ismail I had begun with a combination of theological persuasion and brutal coercion, and that Shah Abbas had refined into a more sophisticated cultural project of Shia institution building, had created a religious identity so powerful and so deeply embedded in Iranian culture, that it would survive everything that came after, but it had done so at the cost of alienating the Sunni population on the empire's fringes, maintaining a permanent state of theological warfare with the Ottoman Empire and generating an internal religious establishment whose political power the later Safavid kings found increasingly difficult to control. After Shah Abbas, the dynasty produced a series of kings more interested in the pleasures of the harem and the wine cellar than in the stern business of governance. And the military reforms Abbas had so carefully built were allowed to decay. Then from the east, from the Afghan highlands, whose restless tribespeople, the Safavids, had never fully pacified, the end arrived in a form so sudden and so humiliating that contemporaries struggled to believe it was happening. This instability continued until the Afghan Ghilzai chief Mir Wise Khan, and then his son Mahmud launched an invasion of the Safavid heartland in 1719 to 1722 CE that exposed the full extent of the dynasty's military decay, capturing Isfahan in 1722 after a 7-month siege, during which tens of thousands of the city's inhabitants died of starvation. And the Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, a deeply pious man more suited to theological contemplation than military command, walked out of his palace and personally placed the crown on the Afghan conqueror's head in an act of surrender that was also, somehow, a gesture of almost unbearable dignity. The Safavid dynasty limped on in diminished form for another 30 years, and eventually a military genius from Khorasan named Nader Shah of Shar expelled the Afghans, reconquered the empire, and launched a series of campaigns so audacious, including an invasion of Mughal India that resulted in the looting of Delhi in 1739 CE and the seizure of the Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, that they would have made him a legend had he not governed with a brutality so extreme that his own officers eventually murdered him in his tent in 1747 CE. After Nader Shah's assassination, Iran fragmented again into competing dynasties until the Qajar family finally reunified the country in 1796 CE. And it was under the Qajar dynasty that the catastrophic encounter with European imperial cartography began. The encounter that eventually produced the misinterpreted map that set this entire story in motion. With the fall of Nader Shah's short-lived Afsharid Empire and the chaos of the subsequent decades, the stage was cleared not for another Iranian dynasty to reassert control in the traditional manner, but for an entirely new kind of challenge, one that arrived not from the steppe or the desert, but from the counting houses and admiralty offices of London and St. Petersburg, wielding not swords, but surveying instruments, trade agreements, and most fatally of all, maps. The Qajar dynasty began its rule over Iran in 1796 CE under Agha Mohammed Khan, a man of such singular ferocity that he had been castrated by his political enemies as a child and had spent his entire adult life in the pursuit of a revenge that was simultaneously personal and dynastic. He reunified Iran by force of will and military talent, but was murdered by his own servants in 1797 CE before he could consolidate what he had built, leaving the task of governance to his nephew Fath Ali Shah, who ruled from 1797 to 1834 CE, and who faced, almost immediately, a challenge unlike anything Iranian rulers had confronted in their long history. The challenge was not a steppe nomad with cavalry, not a religious reformer with an army of devoted followers, not even a neighboring empire with conventional military ambitions. It was the systematic pressure of two modern European empires, the British and the Russian, each of which was expanding toward Iran from opposite directions, and each of which had developed, in the course of their expansion, a bureaucratic and military machine of a kind. The Qajar state was entirely unprepared to understand, let alone resist. Russia had been expanding southward through the Caucasus since the 18th century, absorbing Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani territories that had been part of the Iranian cultural and political world for centuries. Britain anchored in India and expanding northwestward through Afghanistan and Baluchistan saw Iran as the strategic buffer between its Indian empire and any potential Russian southward push toward the Persian Gulf. A geopolitical anxiety they called the Great Game, a phrase that has a certain schoolboy cheerfulness about it that entirely fails to capture the reality of what it meant for the actual people living in the countries being maneuvered over like pieces on a chessboard. Iran lost two disastrous wars with Russia in 1813 CE and 1828 CE. The treaties following which, the Treaty of Gulistan and the Treaty of Turkmenchay, stripped Iran of all its Caucasian territories, established Russian extraterritorial rights in Iran for Russian citizens, and imposed an indemnity of 20 kuror of tomans on a treasury that could not possibly pay it, creating a debt dependency that the Qajars would spend the rest of their dynasty struggling to manage. These treaties were a watershed, not just in Iranian geopolitical terms, but in Iranian cultural and political consciousness. They forced the Iranian educated class to confront, for the first time with genuine urgency, the question of why a civilization with 5,000 years of continuous development had been so decisively outmatched by powers that the Iranians had, until very recently, regarded as relatively peripheral players in the affairs of the world. The answer, worked out painfully over the following decades by a generation of Iranian intellectuals, students, and statesmen who traveled to Europe and returned with a mixture of admiration and alarm, was that the European states had developed institutional forms, constitutional government, professional armies, industrial economies, secular law, that generated military and economic power of a qualitatively different kind from anything the traditional Iranian state could produce, and that Iran would have to transform itself radically if it wanted to survive as an independent entity in the new world that European expansion was creating. This realization produced the Iranian constitutional revolution, which we will reach in due course. But before that, it produced the specific crisis of the misinterpreted map, the map in question. And here we arrive at the heart of the story that the title of this video promised you. Was not a single document, but a series of documents produced by British survey teams working in the borderland between Iran, Afghanistan, and British India throughout the 19th century, culminating in the work of the Boundary Commission that attempted to delineate a formal border between Iran and Afghanistan in the 1870s and 1880s. The problem was geological as much as political. The Sistan region, where Iran, Afghanistan, and what is now Pakistan meet in a landscape of salt flats, river deltas, and desert mountains, contains some of the most ambiguous terrain on Earth for the purpose of drawing political boundaries. Rivers change course, seasonal flooding creates and erases geographic features. The mountain ranges that appear on maps as clear continuous lines are in fact broken, dissected, and interpenetrated by valleys and passes in ways that resist simple linear demarcation. The British surveyors who worked in these conditions in the 1870s and 1880s were working under institutional pressures. They were agents of empire in a hurry, accountable to administrators in Calcutta and London, who wanted maps that showed clear, defensible lines, and who were not particularly interested in the nuances of terrain that made clear lines cartographically honest. The maps they produced were, by the standards of their time, competent pieces of work. By the standards of the diplomatic disputes they generated, they were catastrophic. The specific error, the single misinterpreted map that this video's title describes, centered on the Kai Malik Saya, a mountain in the junction zone of the three-way border, and on the question of which tributary of the Helmand River constituted the actual boundary between Iranian and Afghan territory. The British Boundary Commission of 1872 CE, under Colonel Goldsmid, drew a line based on what appeared on the maps and survey data available to him to be the main channel of the Helmand. The problem was that the Helmand's delta in the Sistan Basin is a braided river system that distributes its flow among multiple channels that shift position over time. And the channel that Goldsmid's map showed as primary was not, in the view of the Iranian government, the one that actually carried the majority of the water. This was not a trivial disagreement. The Helmand's waters were the lifeblood of the Sistan region. They fed the irrigation systems that supported the entire local agricultural economy. And a border drawn along the wrong channel could, over time, direct those waters toward Afghanistan and leave the Iranian side of the border With an increasingly desiccated and depopulated territory, the Iranian government protested immediately and loudly. The British government, which controlled Afghan foreign policy, and therefore effectively controlled the other side of the negotiation, insisted that Goldsmid's line was definitive. The dispute was referred to a second arbitration, the arbitral award of 1905 CE under General MacMahon, which produced a slightly modified line that satisfied neither party and introduced new ambiguities of its own. And then, before the dispute could be resolved through the patient diplomatic channels that might eventually have produced a workable compromise, the entire political context was transformed by a series of events that made the map dispute seem, briefly, almost trivial by comparison. The Iranian constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911 CE was one of the first constitutional revolutions in the non-Western world, a movement driven by a coalition, merchants, clerics, intellectuals, and reformers, who had been watching the Qajar dynasty sell off Iran's resources to foreign powers, telegraph concessions to the British, tobacco monopolies to British investors, oil rights to the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1901 CE, in exchange for loans that enriched the Shah's court while impoverishing the country, and who decided that constitutional government was the only mechanism capable of stopping this process. The constitutional revolution produced Iran's first constitution and parliament in 1906 CE, a document and an institution that represented a genuine and radical break with the traditional absolutist framework of Iranian monarchy. And it was immediately challenged by Qajar Shah Mohammad Ali, who in 1908 CE deployed Russian-officered Persian Cossack troops to bombard the parliament building in Tehran, suspending the constitution and arresting the constitutionalist leaders. The constitutionalists fought back, captured Tehran in 1909 CE, deposed Mohammad Ali, and restored the constitution. A sequence of events that seemed to vindicate the revolutionary movement, except that the restored constitutional government was so weak, so underfunded, and so threatened by both British and Russian interference that it could not exercise real authority over the country's territory or resources. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 CE, signed in St. Petersburg, while Iranian constitutionalists were still fighting for their parliament's survival, divided Iran into 3 zones: a Russian sphere of influence in the north, a British sphere of influence in the southeast, and a nominally neutral zone in the center, without consulting the Iranian government, which was not even informed of the agreement until after it had been signed. This was not merely a diplomatic insult. It was a precise demonstration of the degree to which the 2 European empires regarded Iran as an object of their strategic competition, rather than as a sovereign actor in its own right. And the fury it generated in the Iranian constitutional movement fed directly into the nationalist politics that would dominate Iranian public life for the next century. The discovery of oil at Masjid Solomon in 1908 CE, almost simultaneous with the Russian bombardment of the Iranian parliament, added a new dimension of complexity to the Anglo-Iranian relationship. Suddenly, the British government had a direct material interest in maintaining control over Iranian territory and Iranian governance that went beyond the strategic concerns of the Great Game and into the hard arithmetic of industrial fuel supply. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which controlled the oil concession, became, in effect, a state within a state in the southwestern Iranian province of Khuzestan, building its own infrastructure, employing its own security forces, and remitting to the Iranian government a royalty percentage so small that Iranian finance ministers could only stare at it with a combination of helpless fury and deep embarrassment. Yet even as these geopolitical humiliations accumulated, the Qajar dynasty produced one figure whose significance for Iranian cultural history is difficult to overstate. Nasir al-Din Shah, who ruled from 1848 to 1896 CE, and who, despite being the very monarch who sold the tobacco monopoly and the telegraph concession, and who traveled to Europe 3 times while his own country's infrastructure crumbled, was also the monarch who introduced photography to Iran, founded the first modern school in Tehran, patronized a remarkable generation of Iranian painters, poets, and scholars, and kept a personal diary whose literary quality is remarkable enough that it is still read today as a document of human curiosity and royal self-importance in almost equal measure. Nasir al-Din Shah was murdered in 1896 CE by a follower of the activist Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, a pan-Islamic intellectual whose influence on the constitutional movement and on Islamic political thought more broadly was enormous. Shot while visiting the shrine of Shah Abd al-Azim south of Tehran, he became the first Iranian monarch to die by assassination in nearly a century, and the shock of his death accelerated the political crisis that would produce the constitutional revolution a decade later. The assassin's bullet, fired in a shrine dedicated to a saint of the Shia tradition, managed to compress into a single moment the entire tension between the old religious Iran and the modernizing constitutionalist Iran that was struggling to be born. The border dispute that the misinterpreted map had set in motion did not resolve itself with the arbitral award of 1905 CE. It continued to simmer through the constitutional period, through the First World War, and into the Reza Shah era, generating periodic crises over water rights and territorial demarcation that required diplomatic intervention from third parties. But the map itself had done its damage at a deeper level than any specific territorial dispute. It had become a symbol for Iranian nationalists of the whole system of foreign interference and unequal treatment that the Qajar dynasty's weakness had allowed to be imposed on their country, and the demand for the revision of all treaties, agreements, and boundary settlements that had been extracted from Iran under duress became one of the central demands of the nationalist movement that eventually brought Reza Khan to power. Reza Khan was a soldier, the son of a soldier, and the colonel of the Persian Cossack brigade. The Russian-officered Iranian military unit that had bombarded the Iranian parliament in 1908 CE on behalf of Mohammad Ali Shah, and which Reza Khan had subsequently seized control of and transformed through sheer force of personal authority and military discipline into the most effective military force in the country. In 1921 CE, he launched a coup that brought him to the center of Iranian politics. And in 1925 CE, after a period of steadily accumulating power as prime minister under the last Qajar Shah, he orchestrated his own elevation to the throne, founding the Pahlavi dynasty and taking the name Reza Shah Pahlavi. Pahlavi being a reference to the Middle Persian language of the Sassanid era, a deliberate invocation of pre-Islamic Iranian imperial heritage that announced the new dynasty's ideological program as clearly as if it had been spelled out in a manifesto. Reza Shah was in many ways the Iranian answer to Ataturk in Turkey and to Amanullah in Afghanistan, a military modernizer who believed that the only way to save his country from the kind of colonial subjugation that had humiliated the Qajar dynasty was to transform Iran as rapidly and as thoroughly as possible into a modern state on European lines, and who was prepared to use considerable coercion to accomplish this transformation, regardless of the wishes of the population. Reza Shah's achievement in the 15 years of his effective power before the Allied invasion of 1941 CE was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. He built a nationwide railroad system, the Trans-Iranian Railway, completed in 1930 CE, connecting the Caspian coast to the Persian Gulf through some of the most technically challenging terrain in the world, largely without foreign loans or foreign contractors, funded by a tax on sugar and tea that he imposed precisely to avoid the kind of debt dependency that had trapped the Qajar dynasty. He founded the University of Tehran in 1934 CE, the first modern university in Iran, and sent hundreds of Iranian students to Europe on government scholarships to study engineering, medicine, law, and the sciences, a cohort that would return to staff the institutions of the modern Iranian state, and that would also, in many cases, return with political ideas that Reza Shah found deeply inconvenient. He abolished the capitulation agreements that had given foreign nationals extraterritorial legal status in Iran, essentially declaring that Iranian courts had jurisdiction over everyone on Iranian territory, which sounds like an obvious principle, but which the Qajar dynasty had been unable to enforce against British and Russian pressure. He nationalized large amounts of private and tribal landholding, broke the power of the great nomadic tribes through a forced sedentarization campaign that was genuinely brutal in its implementation and imposed a dress code, including the forced unveiling of women and the requirement that men wear European-style hats. That was simultaneously a modernization program and a statement about the relationship between the state and religion that the Shia clergy understood perfectly and deeply resented. The cultural achievement of the early Pahlavi period was the archaeological excavation and preservation of the pre-Islamic Iranian heritage. Persepolis, Susa, Pasargadae, the sites of the Achaemenid Empire, as part of a deliberate project of constructing a national identity grounded in the Persian imperial tradition rather than in Islam, a project that produced both genuine scholarly achievements and a politically motivated selective reading of Iranian history that emphasized Aryan heritage. The term Iran, meaning land of the Aryans, with consequences that became increasingly uncomfortable as the Nazi regime in Germany gave the concept of Aryan identity a specific and horrifying content. Reza Shah had cultivated a relationship with Nazi Germany throughout the 1930s as a counterbalance to British and Soviet influence. And when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 CE, the British and Soviet governments decided that they could not afford to leave Iran's railroad, which represented the most efficient route for supplying the Soviet war effort, in the hands of a government with pro-German sympathies. In August 1941 CE, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran simultaneously from north and south, occupied the country in a matter of days, forced Reza Shah to abdicate in favor of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza, and sent the former Shah into exile in South Africa, where he died in 1944 CE. A fate that the Iranian nationalist movement would remember for decades as a paradigmatic example of great power contempt for Iranian sovereignty. Mohammad Reza Shah came to the throne as a young man under foreign occupation, and the shadow of his father's forced abdication lay over his entire reign, shaping both his political instincts, a deep anxiety about great power interference that oscillated between appeasement and defiance, and his personal style, which lacked his father's military bluntness and operated instead through a more complicated combination of sophisticated charm, political manipulation, and increasingly, as the decades passed, an autocratic rigidity that proved to be his undoing. The great crisis of his early reign came not from foreign invasion, but from within. The nationalist movement led by Mohammad Mossadegh, who became prime minister in 1951 CE, and immediately moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, arguing that Iran's oil resources belonged to Iran, and that the agreement under which Britain extracted most of the profits was not a contract between equals, but an instrument of exploitation. The nationalization of the oil company was greeted in Iran with an explosion of popular enthusiasm that cut across class lines and political affiliations. Even the Shia clergy, who were otherwise suspicious of Mossadegh's secular nationalism, supported the oil nationalization as a matter of national dignity. And it generated in Britain a fury so intense that the British government persuaded the American CIA and the British MI6 to organize the coup that in August 1953 CE overthrew Mossadegh's democratically elected government, restored the Shah to full power, and returned the oil concession to a consortium that included British and American companies under somewhat more favorable terms for Iran than before. The coup of 1953 CE, known in Iran as the 28 Mordad coup, after the date in the Iranian calendar on which it occurred, became and remains one of the defining events in Iranian political consciousness, a wound in the national memory that has never fully closed, and that explains, more than any other single event, the specific character of the anti-American sentiment that became central to the Islamic Revolution of 1979 CE. The Shah, restored to full autocratic power with American support, pursued a program of rapid modernization that he called the White Revolution. Launched in 1963 CE, which included land reform, women's suffrage, literacy campaigns, and industrialization, all real and substantial achievements, while simultaneously suppressing political opposition through SAVAK, the secret police agency, established with American and Israeli assistance in 1957 CE, whose methods included torture and imprisonment of dissidents across the political spectrum, from communist to Islamist to liberal nationalist. The cultural achievement of the late Pahlavi era was genuine and significant. The establishment of cultural institutions, museums, universities, and public health infrastructure that transformed Iranian society in measurable ways. But it was achieved in a context of increasing political repression that made the cultural achievements feel, to many Iranians, like decorations on a cage. The Shah's celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire at Persepolis in 1971 CE, a spectacular event attended by almost every head of state in the world, catered by Maxims of Paris, featuring food and entertainment flown in from France, while large parts of the Iranian population lived in poverty, crystallized the contradiction between the regime's imperial self-presentation and the social reality it was presiding over in a way that no amount of SAVAK intimidation could suppress. The Islamic Revolution of February 1979 CE was not simply a religious revolt against a secular monarchy. It was the convergence of every unresolved tension in Iranian history, ancient and modern, in a single extraordinary explosion of collective political will. The clerical leadership under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been in exile since 1964 CE, after denouncing the White Revolution as a surrender to American imperialism and Zionism, provided the organizational framework and the ideological vocabulary for a movement whose actual participants included secular nationalists, Marxists, liberals, merchants, students, workers, and every other segment of Iranian society that had a grievance against the Pahlavi regime, which, by 1978 CE, was almost everyone. The revolution drew on the Shia theological tradition of martyrdom and resistance to unjust authority, on the Safavid legacy of religious identity as the core of Iranian national consciousness, on the constitutional revolution's demand for sovereignty and representative government, and on the nationalist tradition of Mossadegh's resistance to foreign interference, weaving these threads into an ideology of Islamic republicanism that was genuinely new, an attempt to combine the divine sovereignty of God with the popular sovereignty of the nation in a constitutional structure that theologians and political scientists are still arguing about today. The border dispute of the misinterpreted map, which had never been fully resolved, now became one item in an enormous list of unresolved territorial, legal, and economic claims that the new Islamic Republic intended to revisit. And while the Helmand water dispute was not itself a major driver of any particular conflict, it was symptomatic of a whole category of agreements, treaties, and boundary settlements that the revolutionary government regarded as products of Qajar weakness and foreign manipulation, rather than legitimate expressions of Iranian sovereign will. The Islamic Republic that Khomeini established survived a devastating 8-year war with Iraq between 1980 and 1988 CE, a war triggered by Saddam Hussein's invasion in September 1980 CE, which the Iraqi president launched partly in hopes of taking advantage of the revolutionary chaos in Iran, and partly with American and Gulf Arab encouragement, and which ultimately resolved nothing except the death of approximately 500,000 people on both sides, and the physical devastation of the Iranian provinces of Khuzestan and Kurdistan, the same region where the Anglo-Persian Oil Company had built its first refinery, the same region that the misinterpreted map's boundary disputes had partly encompassed. The war shaped the Islamic Republic's institutional culture in ways that are still operative today. The Revolutionary Guards, established in the early days of the revolution as a counterweight to the regular military, grew into an enormous parallel state with economic, military, and intelligence functions that make it arguably the most powerful single institution in the country. And it created a generation of war veterans whose experience of sacrifice and survival became the foundational mythology of the Republic in much the same way that the constitutional revolution had been the foundational mythology of the nationalist movement. The map, the original British survey map whose ambiguous lines had set the Sistan boundary dispute in motion, sits today in archival boxes in Tehran and Kabul and London. Its ink faded, its contested lines no longer legible to ordinary eyes. And yet, the political consequences it set in motion continue to run through the relationship between Iran and Afghanistan like underground water through limestone, invisible on the surface, shaping everything below it, surfacing unexpectedly in negotiations over the Helmand River's water allocation that are taking place as of 2026, with the Taliban government in Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic in Iran still arguing, in essence, over a question that a careless British surveyor could not have known he was creating in a surveying camp in the Baluchistan desert in the 1870s. The story of the misinterpreted map is, at its deepest level, a story about the relationship between the lines we draw and the lives we force to conform to them. About how a surveyor's error, compounded by an empire's arrogance, compounded by a dynasty's weakness, compounded by a revolution's unfinished business, can travel through a century and a half of history and arrive in the 21st century still sharp enough to cut. Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in 1953 CE for daring to assert that the resources beneath Iranian soil belonged to the Iranians who lived above it. A proposition so apparently dangerous to the Western powers that they destroyed a democracy to prevent it from being acted upon. Ayatollah Khomeini built a republic on the proposition that God's law and the people's will could coexist in a single constitutional structure, a proposition whose implementation has generated 45 years of argument, suppression, protest, and reform, and the water of the Helmand River, which fed the civilization of Sistan before any empire existed, and will continue flowing long after the last state has crumbled, runs where geography directs it, indifferent to the lines that ambitious men have drawn across the maps of a world they never fully understood. The question of who controls that water, Iran or Afghanistan, Helmand or Sistan, the old world or the new, remains, as of this moment, unanswered, which means that the story that began with a proto-Elamite farmer digging an irrigation channel 5,000 years ago on the Iranian plateau is not finished yet. And perhaps it never will be, because the water is still flowing and the lines are still being drawn, and history, as always, is still being written in the only ink that lasts, the restless, irrepressible human need to claim a piece of the earth and call it home. Original characters 0.